right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 205 or 6 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I have my regular co-host, Ian Kummer, streaming live from, I think he's in Crimea currently. Hopefully his connection will stay strong for us throughout the program. We got two special guests. Andrew is an academic from the Midwest. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. And we got Leo Zhao. He has put his brand Goods for the People as his name. He's streaming live from East Berlin. He's got some great products. Check out Goods for the People. Great tanky attire. Okay, so we wanted to throw it to Ian first off because Ian has recently written a great article where he is kind of describing the contradictions that are appearing very vividly as the empire declines. But I'm using my words. I want Ian just to maybe just kind of describe his article, and then we're going to get into a broader discussion.
Yes. Hello, everybody. So I'm here in Crimea, and so a little while ago, I wrote a two-parter article on my blog, readingjunkie.com, which is the links to these are in the description as well. And you are on actually the page for this stream. Actually, you're not on the article itself. There's
okay.
If you go back to the main page, but anyway, so my thesis in these posts was that the Ukraine and the Ukraine war with Russia is an existential issue for Western regimes, particularly Europe. I treat the USA and Europe separately because they are separate. They're separate entities with goals that are very often mutually exclusive. So for Europe in particular, Russia's the number one priority for them. And so I predict that a collapse on the Ukraine front will force a political reckoning for the progressive left, if you will, left-leaning regimes in Europe, particularly Western Europe, Germany, France, Britain, the big well, Britain isn't in the EU anymore, but Italy, Spain. It's going to push a very large shift to the right, because right now the left-identifying parties are in power, and a lot of the failures and mismanagement in the Ukraine war can be directly attributed to them, their decisions, and to an extent their ideology, because there are certain things they were unwilling to do. There were certain lines they were unwilling, or at least hesitant to cross to win in Ukraine. So I think when it's very clear it's not going to be a victory, when it turns into a win for Russia, I think that is going to that's going to be too big of a crisis for them to sweep under the rug, and that is going to lead to a resurgence of these right-leaning parties in Europe. And contrary to the exhausted talking point that we hear every day, these are not pro-Russia parties. The AfD in Germany, the Spanish right-wing party, Le Pen's party in France. None of these groups are pro-Russia, even though they're constantly called pro-Russia in the news. They are not. They're basically in agreement with the left-leaning parties. Russia's the primary enemy. And that, on top of the other things going on right now, I also mentioned that Israel and the USA are pushing Europe very hard right now, especially with the Iran war, which is directly hurting their war effort in Ukraine. It's not just diverting munitions, it's causing a global energy crisis. It's doing a lot of things that are bad for Ukraine. And also there is the immigration scandal in Spain where the Moroccans, which incidentally Morocco is a staunch U.S. and Israeli, oddly enough, Israeli ally. that big surge of immigrants into Spanish territory, which is not in Spain itself. I know there was some confusion about that. People were like, wait, how did they swim across, the Gibraltar? No, it's actually on the North African side of it. It's a Spanish colonial holdover that's populated by Spanish people, but it's on the North African side. So there's a short swim or walk to that side. But anyways, and that was interpreted by a lot of people as actually the USA and Israel putting pressure on the leftist government of Spain, because they're very they speak out a lot against, and it's not new for Spain. Like even with the invasion of Iraq under Bush, Spain was one of the outliers, very loudly condemning that and condemning Bush specifically for doing this. It's not new for them. So a lot of people interpreted that immigration crisis as Israel and the USA pressuring Spain and possibly even causing an electoral crisis for them, because immigration, like most Western countries, is a very hot button issue there. So I also think so I brought up that example because I think they're overplaying their hand a lot. They very wildly overestimate their hold on Europe. I think they can actually cause a split. And this is going to be this is going to be the main issue that causes this split is Ukraine. So that's kind of the synopsis of what I wrote. I can go into more detail on certain things if anyone would like to start.
So the provocative gist is that losing the Ukraine war is going to force a crisis that is going to push Europe back to its Nazi roots, essentially.
Yes. That's the shortest way to say it. Yes, shortest, most provocative way to say it. Yes, and, because and it was the same thing. Actually, I specifically brought up Weimar in my article. I explicitly brought up Weimar Germany and the Nazi Party. Yeah, this very goofy. It was goofy. Let's be honest. Weimar Germany was very goofy. There a lot of things that were let's call it strange. They had a lot of strange ideas. And Nazi Germany took power, and of course, Hitler was not the pro-Russia party. It'd be kind of funny. I think if Hitler was alive today, they would accuse him of being pro-Russia until he took office. Probably, literally, it's not even an exaggeration. But then they took power, and of course, they made it their whole agenda, their whole identity that we're a shield against Europe. We're saving Western civilization from Bolsheviks. And so, yes.
Okay, I'm wondering which of our esteemed guests would like to have a follow-up.
And that's interesting because they're both in Germany, so I'll be very interested to hear what they think of that.
Well, Andrew's in the Midwest.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you said there was Leo that's in Berlin. Yeah, Leo's in Berlin. And you're in the Midwest.
So
yeah.
Got a different take on this one. So
I would say Europe is turning fascist due to, or will soon go full fascist due to these absolutely these imperialist wars of hegemony that the U.S. is waging and the contradictory fallout in Ukraine, in Iran as well. There are some contradictions there, but I think that's one of the factors, right? That's one of the factors. I think most important are the structural factors for the necessity of the return of full-fledged fascism because of the systemic contradictions of capitalism and imperialism, which are twins, which are two sides of the same coin. The export of manufacturing, the offshoring of manufacturing has depleted the imperial core of productive capacity. The financialization of Wall Street in the late 70s has built a very precarious house of cards, which is just about to tumble or just about to collapse. The falling rate of profit for the oligarchic bourgeois ruling class is something that they need to remedy as soon as possible. They will try to remedy. So I think these are the overall structural, larger causation factors that I would say for fascism again raising its disgusting head.
Can you, for our liberal viewers, can you define fascism appropriately?
Fascism is the brutal entrenchment or establishment of the bourgeois order, of the rule of the property owning class. When liberalism is the polite twin brother of fascism, and fascism is the impolite, rude twin brother of liberalism. Liberalism is the idea that a few people can own everything and control the state, and everyone else can have access to freedom, community, and equality. It is a fraudulent idea. And liberalism is the idea of capitalism, and so is fascism. When liberalism no longer gets the job done, when contradictions are unfolding, which is causing liberalism's fraudulence to come to the surface, and its facade is breaking apart, fascism is needed to reimpose the absolute rule of the bourgeois class, of the property owning class, of the profit generating property owning class. So that is the role of fascism. Fascism is always supported by the corporates. I mean, Hitler himself said Nazism is corporate power. It is the expression of corporate power. And today, the bourgeois ruling class needs to further bleed the working class in order to keep up the rate of profit, to further dismantle what little working class power is left after 40 years of neoliberalism, at home and abroad, to wage war against anti-imperialist countries.
I totally agree with that. I appreciate everything you said. I would quickly add that, they really need to drag humanity into a place that humanity doesn't want to go, right? It's like, they're going to be doing things that are very unpopular and that are going to immiserate and cause death and destruction. And so they need fascists to do that, because, good liberals like Kamala Harris can never get away with that. So fascism is on the rise because they have to drag us, to a place that is very unpopular with the masses. So that's what I wanted to add. But Andrew, there's a lot that's been said. I'm sure there's any number of points that you would like to add or respond to.
Yeah, I generally agree with Ian's analysis and the follow-up on this. And I think that when you look at the conflict internationally that's occurring, it's a symptom of a more systematic failing. Empires tend to lash out and overextend before they collapse. And they can no longer enforce their will on their colonies. And often, when it gets to the late stage of it, their own internal population, so they retrench. I think, though, what I can add to it is, when you look at the thinking that gives rise to fascism, and that's the important thing, and it really does parallel what Ian was saying about Weimar Germany, it's the failure of the system to correct itself. So you have internal tensions within an empire, rising levels of inequality. People are just not doing as well as they should. They know that there's something wrong. It occurs independent of their ideology, and that creates tension. And the tension then motivates political action. And where fascism comes into play is that rather than have a clear theoretical understanding of what the problems are and how you resolve them, people lash out. They lash out at a foreign enemy. They lash out at a minority within the population, or an ideological boogeyman that they don't understand, the leftists, the communists, whatever, usually with fascism. And they don't think about the solutions to the problem because they're incapable of doing it, because they've grown up in a system that's predisposed them to it. So, being in the US, what I see right now is there's a lot of pain. Maybe not as bad as in a war zone, but people are realizing, yeah, my standard of living isn't what it was 50 years ago or 30 years ago. Things are not where they should be. People are voicing discontent. So just last week, you look at the kind of paleo conservatives, libertarians like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tucker Carlson or Thomas Massey. They're talking about starting a new party. Okay, yeah, it's populist discontent. You go and you look up the platform of that party. It's not, yeah, we need an egalitarian economic system. We need to stop, the wars of aggression. It's just these very idealized, very euphemistic talking points like we need to beautify society. And really what fascism is it parallels that thinking. It's an idealized, atheoretical solution to a problem that really doesn't end up solving the problem. It only exacerbates the problem because it's not thinking about the solution. And invariably, when you don't have a reformation, either in a radical sense, so you have a political revolution, or an internal reformation where people acknowledge that, yeah, neoliberalism has failed. This system that we're in is not working for most people. The crazies come in and basically act as snake oil salesmen and give us, false hope that exploits our bigotries, that it exploits what we've been taught. And that really is the primrose path to our own destruction. Because you can blame immigrants all you want, you can start all the wars you want. It's not going to fix the failing of the social and economic system in a modern developed country.
Well, I like that point about their propaganda appeals to an existing indoctrination.
Yeah.
And so they're really just speaking to a mindset that they themselves have created and inculcated over generations, with their propaganda. And yeah, people are just not able to question certain premises that they have in their minds that the propaganda is designed to appeal to. Capitalism is good. I mean, we know that capitalism is synonymous with prosperity. We know that socialism is synonymous with, depravity, gulags, mass deaths, and starvation. So given that reality, like, how are we supposed to go forward? So, the populists have an answer. Tucker Carlson has an answer to that question for you. But yeah, it's not going to get anywhere because the fundamental premise is just deliberately wrong and misleading. So this is a great discussion. I enjoy this. Where do we, who else wants to add or take us in a particular direction?
Yeah, capitalism has failed repeatedly, right? In the 1920s, and World War II was another collapse of global capitalism. And each time after the collapse, communism becomes very popular. In the 1920s, the U.S., I believe Eugene Debs would have probably won the election, if not for a violent repression in the United States itself. And certainly in Europe, all over Western Europe, the communist forces needed to be violently crushed by the funding of the Nazis, by the funding of Mussolini's party, by the funding of Franco's party, or the Spanish fascist party, in order to repress violently the upsurge of socialism, of historical progress that truly moves us beyond the impasse of contradictions of capitalism. So when people's movement forward, the progress of history is blocked, and the only other option, it's a false option. It's a false option that may, in the very short term, alleviate some of the immediate problems of capitalism. The Nazi Party did, revive German economy for a very brief 4 years. I've sometimes in the past compared fascism to curing your flu with methamphetamine. So if you're feeling terrible, you've got the flu, If you take some meth, like your nose is no longer stuffed up, and you feel amazing. You feel like Superman, like whoa,
It's
for
not an
like
endorsement. Not an endorsement.
not in well, you feel amazing, right? Your flu symptoms are gone for about maybe 8 hours, or if you keep doing lines, maybe 12 hours, maybe 2 or 3 days, even if you really go manic. But after 2 or 3 days, those flu symptoms are going to come back 10 times harder. And that's inescapable. So that's a sort of funny anecdote to illustrate the effect, the real effects of fascism. It briefly seems to alleviate the symptoms of capitalism, but actually it re-entrenches the rule of the profit generating property owning class, and
That's
prevents
a great point.
us from moving forward.
Todd brings up a question kind of to Ian about how he frames the parties, the European parties in his article. And so from our perspective,
Can you display?
Yeah.
Can you display that comment for me?
Yes. So,
Okay, French bourgeois parties in Europe as left or right is misleading, or the Democrats left. Well, that's why I said left to identify. I mean, and I got this in the comments of my original post as well. It's like, well, they're not real leftists. This party isn't a real leftist, and all that. Well, it's a true Scotsman argument, which I really didn't want to go into. I mean, there's not really. I think the world's changed so much in the last, since 1991. It actually defies the normal labels that we've had for the past 200 years. Now, there were some, I had to step away from the discussion for a minute because there was a scandal outside. But I did like Andrew's comment about the failure of one system to, the failure to make systemic changes. And there's actually a good example of that. Stanley Kubrick's film Clockwork Orange, which is set in a dystopian Britain, which is pretty much the way Britain actually is. It's barely a dystopian Britain, it's just the way it is. The main character is this rapist, serial killer, just terrible person who is caught for all of his crimes. And the premise of the movie, I guess also the book that's based on, is that you have this very progressive liberal government, and they decide we're going to, instead of just locking up this guy for life, we're going to do this, we're going to reform him. We're going to do this advanced brainwashing technique to reform him. And basically this whole thing backfires on them, and it actually causes a large enough scandal to actually remove that party from power and put the far right party that's doing their tough on crime, beautify Britain type thing. It actually puts them in power at the end of the movie. I think that's actually not a bad example of what I think is going to happen with Europe. Because the problem with Europe for the past several or even longer than that, 400 years or longer, they don't seem very good at finding a happy middle ground, right? They go from one extreme to the other. Weimar being one extreme, and then Nazi Germany being the other extreme. And so that's what I think that's the main thing I'm saying in these posts. I don't think we're going to have these right wing, because I would even think if these right wing parties were just focused on at home, they wouldn't necessarily even be a bad thing. That's the problem. They're not just focused on home. They have that same, they share with their counterparts in the other side of the aisle. They share these same ideals of, we're going to fix the world. We're going to eliminate these terrible enemies that are threatening, Western civilization and the Garden of Europe and all that. So, and I think that's what's going to happen. And Andrew looks like he wants to say something.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think that the key here is that you have to distinguish mainstream liberals from the left. And even if you're around in the US, a lot of conservatives, there are splinter conservative groups that they're speaking their own language. I don't think they fully get certain things, but they've broken off from the mainstream as well. They may become fascist, they may reform themselves, but the key understanding here is that liberals are part of the same establishment. And you see this especially in majoritarian American politics.
Could you restate one more time the key thing? Because right when you said the key thing, it kind of broke up for me.
Okay, sorry. Liberals are part of the mainstream establishment. They are part of the ruling class. They're just a different flavor. It's like chocolate and vanilla ice cream. It's all ice cream. So when you look at their value system, you look at their willingness to fundamentally change the system, they won't do that. So I think, Billy, you've posted a lot of stuff about people like Abdul al-Said. He's saying good things. I think you could claim that he's a reformer, but he'll turn into AOC because he's a product of that same establishment. And I think that that's what leads people to the fascist option, is when there is no real opposition and when the liberals are just a more PC version of the same empire that want to force austerity on you in the name of environmentalism and social justice rather than neoliberalism, why would people support any of them? So one of the things that you see in America in the last decade is a lot of people either stop voting, especially in national elections, or a lot of people who might be considered progressive or even leftist ended up voting for Trump out of pure frustration. And that, I think, gets into the whole zeitgeist issue of the system and ideology. It's very good at not changing. It's good at not considering new information or new ideas. It's good at preserving itself. And where the fascism comes into play and where it ultimately leads to destruction is any system that does not reform itself ultimately destroys itself because it collapses under its own contradictions and under the amount of weight of pain that it puts on people. And you see this geopolitically. We're just going and starting one war after another. Our empire really can't keep up with it. America's now depleted most of its defensive missiles in these wars with Ukraine and Iran. Internally, things aren't going well, but you can't count on a Democrat or a liberal or even somebody like Bernie Sanders to fix it, because it's just not in their vocabulary, because they're part of the same animal as the right. And you can't understand politics until you acknowledge that the liberal is really part of the establishment, and that until they realign, nothing's going to get fixed.
Yeah, Ian referred to. Sorry, Leo, you're muted, so it's easy for me to interrupt you and talk over you because you're muted. But I was going to mention, so when Ian said, Europe is swinging from one extreme to the other extreme, that was my thought. I was like, well, it's extremes within oligarchy, a liberal oligarchy to a illiberal oligarchy. But these are not real extremes. They're extremes within, just one side. Like the real left opposes oligarchy. It's not just the liberal face of oligarchy. So these are the complexities that we got to keep in mind when we are analyzing and we got to figure out who we're talking to. Like to a Republican voter, a liberal is just a Democratic voter. But to us, a Republican and a liberal Democratic voter are on the same side politically. They're aligned politically on the same side together against those of us who want to end oligarchy.
Absolutely. What I was going to say is that, similar to Andrew's point, that we need to distinguish the authentic left from liberals, which are the progressive wing of liberalism. I would say the culturally progressive wing of liberalism. We should also probably distinguish the populist right, which is the conservative, the socially, culturally conservative wing of liberalism, right? From actual fascism. And like the populist right today is not fully fascist yet. It's on its way. It's well underway. We can, talk about the degrees, But yeah, both the culturally conservative wing of liberalism and the culturally progressive wing of liberalism are both liberalism. And liberalism is pro-capitalism. It is pro-imperialism. Liberalism is the ideology of capitalism, of imperialism. So people are fighting battles to the death, and it is a fake battle. It is not a real battle. The real battle is not being fought because the means with which we can fight the real battle against the oligarchy, against the profit generating property owning class is not on the table anymore. So it is a false dichotomy that the supposed liberal left and the liberal right are fighting. And what we need to do is to put the real option back on the table, the real war that we need to fight as working class people, as people who work for a living rather than own for a living, right? We need to put that battle back on the table. We need to put that option of real progress of society, moving beyond oligarchy, moving beyond the totalitarian, authoritarian rule of the profit-generating, property-owning class.
And their conscious strategy is to maintain this this culture war, this Republican, a Democrat, conservative, Republican, liberal, really, getting people involved in things that don't really matter, right? Taking one of the two sides that the oligarchy divides itself into and really just calling it a culture war is the best shorthand. But I mean, of course you can get more detailed, but they want us to focus on the culture war. All their media apparatus is entirely dedicated to wrapping people into this culture war, taking one of the two sides of the oligarchy. And then they label, actual opposition, which is socialism, as something that's evil and unconscionable. And, why would anybody ever support that? So this is how they frame it with their $1 trillion, propaganda apparatus, etc. And it's quite effective because, I engage with people on social media and I understand how confused they are and how effective their propaganda is. Andrew, I'm sure you have a lot of things to share.
Well,
oh yeah. I mean, to that point, I think that the key in terms of overcoming it is talking to people and getting to know them, and it has to be at a very cellular level where you don't stay in your own group. You go and talk to people who you might perceive of as disagreeing with you. I do a lot of work in public policy and consulting, and I run across people of all different backgrounds. And one of the things I've noticed, I kind of alluded to it before, is when you look at, let's say, those paleo conservatives or libertarians, they're not bad people. I think that they're just misunderstanding certain things. Or even maybe not the leadership, but a lot of the liberal types that, let's say, they're middle management and they listen to NPR, so neoliberal propaganda radio, and they're drinking the Kool-Aid. They know that there's a problem, but the outlet that's giving them information and feeding them a narrative about what the problem is overwhelms their reasoning, and they're not provided with an alternative. And as an academic, what I've seen, and I've been doing policy work now for about 25 years. And I used to think I was just kind of crazy for thinking this because I kind of came of age in the late 90s and, the height of our neoliberal glory and the rhetoric that we're at the end of history and the world is flat. But what you see in terms of even academic understanding is, as the earlier point was made, there isn't an understanding or exploration of alternatives or even honest empirical work. So teaching economics, which I teach entry-level economics classes, what I see is that certain discussions of things are off balance because the ideology prohibits it. And people develop an emotional opposition to talking about, all right, why do markets not work and where don't they work? And why is the idea of the free market really kind of...
Billy Bob, you're muted.
Say again.
Oh, I was
Telling
making
Billy
a
about-
comment. I was interjecting while you were talking, but I was muted, so it was just confusing to everybody. But I was telling you, Andrew, it's the state. The free markets work perfectly. Any problem with the free market is the state. You know this, Andrew.
Exactly. And it becomes almost a religious-like ideology. And ultimately, where the progress can be made and what it needs to overcome is you have to, one, cognitively engage people with rational arguments, but you also have to understand a lot of the belief system, even with politicians. And I think that when we look at the European liberals, the ones that are really pushing the conflict with Russia and backing the US, a lot of it is emotional programming to the point where even when presented with a rational argument, the emotional programming is so strong that they just ignore it and they just keep prancing down the path that they're on. And unfortunately, I think what happens if you can't engage people and kind of correct them and teach them other ways of thinking is they end up doing things that are wrong because their worldview doesn't comport with reality. And eventually, yeah, it creates World War III. It creates an economic depression. It creates a genocide or an ethnic cleansing. And by that point, it's too late. And yeah, after the conflict's over and a ton of people have died and there's a lot of suffering, people wake up and say, yeah, that was a really stupid thing. I shouldn't have done it. But until that point happens, people don't correct. And I think that that really is the challenge. And, you know, again, it really is going out and engaging people, trying to keep dialogues alive and going with people you might not agree with, who might not completely get it, because maybe they'll remember it and say, yeah, you know, this war with Iran really doesn't make sense. Or, yeah, it's not going to be the end of society if everybody gets health care, or we regulate a corporation more, or whatever else. And I think that that's the real challenge.
Yeah. Here in Germany, it's largely the same. We have these diehard liberals, progressive liberals, the Green Party and Die Linke, that are just so generationally brainwashed, for lack of shorthand. I mean, just the other day, a good friend of ours, my girlfriend's good friend, like super kind person, super nice person, amazing, and she's just pro-Israel and pro-Ukraine. At least there's no contradiction there. She's just pro-imperialism through and through. It's just amazing, and she thinks Ian's article pointed out or observed very accurately that today the hatred of communism, the hatred of the USSR, is becoming stronger than the aversion to Nazism, to fascism. And yeah, obviously this is extremely worrying. It is terrifying, but that is a accurate observation, because people like this, like our friend, absolutely think Stalin is probably worse than Hitler. She just gave us a present, a book called Stalin's Roses. No, what is it called? Something Roses. But anyway, just full of absolute fabricated fictions of the oppressive Soviet Union. But yeah, I'm not sure if each one of us going out and talking to people is, I mean, that's kind of, we are in an oceans of reaction, right? We are in, we each one of us, we are the minority in the West. We are floating on an ocean of reaction and hegemonic normalized liberalism. I think the answer, the way forward, there's no shortcut. It is organization. It is party organization. As like daunting, as difficult as it seems right now, I think there is no other way. I think joining a party and organizing with your comrades I think amplifies your voice and your messaging capacities. Yeah, we'll stop there.
I mean,
So I have
Lennon
some
talked about the immensity of the
pushback
task, but
on a
Ian, there's been
couple of
a lot has
these
been said.
things.
Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, so I have a pushback on a couple of things. So saying there's no real extremes in, it's just oligarch factions and there's no real extremes. Well, of course there are extremes, and right now we're at one extreme, and you can see this, for example, with immigration. There's just immigration is great. We're deconstructing colonialism. They have this law. I mean, we've all seen them. It's this huge, very elaborate, ideology of why immigration's good, mass immigration. Or you can go to the other extreme of saying immigrants are bad. We're going to deport them all. We're going to put them in camps. I mean, I wouldn't sit there and say, oh, that's not an extreme. That's just a different oligarch. No, that's an extreme. Going, immigrants are wonderful. We should just have infinite immigrants. Going to the opposite end, saying, well, all immigrants are bad. We're going to put them in camps. Well, I would call that an extreme, right? And the reason why I think that's relevant is because these are not war economies. These countries, these liberal countries, are actually incapable of being war economies. And the reason why is, I'm sorry, you can't have you can't import dudes from Syria and Somalia and wherever and put them on the dole, have a third of your population do it. No, you can't. In a war economy, it's butter for guns. You cut all the fat, you cut all the welfare, you cut every little thing that's obstructing your ability to make more guns and ammo, you cut it. And the reality is those people they brought in are not going to want to be sold. I mean, really, ask some dude from Syria who's hanging out in Berlin or in Paris, do you want to be conscripted and go die in a trench in, Kursk? What do you think that dude's going to say? No, I want to smoke weed. I want to have a good time, enjoy the site. No, none of those dudes want to fight. And I think, so that's why I think an extreme enough military disaster in Ukraine will push that shift, because that's just survival instincts. So they do see it as an existential war with Russia. And like Leo said, I did cite communism, that they do fear, they hate the Soviet Union in World War II much more than they hate Germany. And they're basically a few years out from just outright rehabilitating Nazi Germany. But I think that this conflict we're seeing with Russia actually predates communism. It goes back to hundreds of years. It's an ethnic conflict. It's just very, very it's just so hardwired in their brains. They can't even exactly quantify why they feel that way. It's just this hardwired ethnic conflicts that we're seeing here. And I think they are going to go to very extreme measure. There is a camp. There's a debate about this. Like in Russia, there's debates. in international circles, there's a debate. Is Europe this paper tiger that's going to just be ineffective, not be able to have any resistance at all? And I used to kind of almost be in that camp, but there's a couple of things that have changed my mind recently. One, when Trump defunded Ukraine, he didn't exactly defund. He didn't say we're going to stop sending weapons to Ukraine. That's repeated. It's not true. He didn't cut back the weapons. He did, however, say, well, we're not going to give them free weapons anymore. We're going to give them free aid. So what happened was the financial burden shifted from the USA to Europe. So it was basically a 50-50 split under Biden. Now it's more like an 80-20 split financially between Europe and the USA. And Europe has shouldered that to a greater extent than I thought they would, to the point their own economies are actually suffering on it, but they're suffering through it. And we could dismiss that and say, oh, well, they're just vassals of USA. They'll do whatever the USA tells them. I don't think that's exactly true either. It's not so much because they want to do what the USA wants them to. They just hate Russia that much. So I think we're going to see more of that. And the other thing was what I mentioned was the immigration crisis with Spain. I was actually very surprised by the European media coverage, because usually the European media coverage of these immigration related events is like, oh, well, it's the far right. Oh, it's Kremlin propaganda. It's all this stuff. I saw very little of that. I was actually very surprised. Most of the European coverage I saw was very negative towards that. I was actually surprised. And so I think that's a sign that the U.S. is pushing them too hard. And I think Trump does have a role in that, because what Trump did, he didn't change U.S. policy, because the U.S. has had a hostile, destructive policy towards Europe. It's viewed Europe as an economic and political competitor since World War II, maybe earlier than that. But Trump came out and said these things, because the previous presidents just come out and say, Europe is just this dog we're going to whip because it's fun. But Trump actually came out and said these things, and that really Europeans are to a much greater extent than Americans are much more preoccupied with norms and with procedures, and it's like, because it's very aristocratic. They're very aristocratic minded people. There's formalities that you're all excuse me, there's these ritualistic formalities you're supposed to follow with each other. Trump doesn't follow them. That just really triggered them. They're very upset about it, and so I do see these rifts appearing. That's my main thing. And it's so saying there's no difference between the, if you will, left and right wing. I don't think that's true, because you are going to see actual quantifiable differences. Even the thing, like, I think it was Daryl mentioned how the Vox party in Spain is pro-Zionist. Well, that's true. In my second post here, I said I think there's a lot of evidence for the idea that the European right and Zionists, the Jewish lobby, if you will, it's an alliance of convenience. I mean, yes, in the USA, the Lindsey Grahams and the Huckabees, Trumps, and all this, they're actually legitimately in love with Israel, and think it's the end times, and they have to do all blah blah blah. I don't see that in Europe. It's much more an alliance of convenience for several reasons. You could write out, you could discuss at length the multiple reasons, but at the end of the day, I think it's an alliance of convenience. And the thing is, once alliances of convenience happen when when the parties in that alliance are both weak and they aren't in power. But when somebody gets in power, he doesn't need those alliances anymore. So I think if I'm right, you see a major electoral shift to the right in Europe. They won't keep the Zionists if they're a burden. And by a burden, I think if the Zionists stick to being pro-immigration, if they stick to being the US, doing what the USA wants, even when it hurts Europe militarily and economically, I think if the Zionists don't navigate that correctly and make the correct choices, I think they're going to drop the Zionists very quick. And anti-Semitism is not a new thing in Europe. I don't think it's a thing they're shy about. I mean, they say all this stuff like, Holocaust, blah, 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 blah. They're very fast to drop those talking points when they stop being convenient. It's very cynical. It's an extremely cynical mind that's capable of that, but I think they're not married to Zionism anywhere to the extent they think.
Yeah, it will be very interesting.
Daryl's comment.
It will be very interesting
to
see what happens. It will be very interesting to see what happens in Germany when the U.S. drops Israel, as the Iran war reaches like untenable proportions. Because it's the Staatsräson of Germany. It's the reason for Germany's existence, Israel. So that will be very interesting.
You're mute.
And Billy Bob, you're muted.
Okay, so I was just going to say, Ian, a lot was said, and I want to try and summarize. I mean, your main point was just that you want to kind of put forward here is your prediction that, Europe really is for like natural ethnic reasons going to revert to Nazism, and you're kind of attributing that turn to this gene level reality that exists within Europeans to kind of hate Slavs. Maybe it seems to be what you're saying, and based on that, you're predicting that there's going to be a return to Nazism and just perpetual conflict, escalated conflict with Russia, and it's gonna need to get worse in order to justify and make the soft liberal Europeans willing to die in the trenches of Kursk, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're alleging. And so
maybe let me
something about that.
That's one point.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
The ethnic anti-Slav racism, right? There is absolutely centuries of history of this. Western Europeans have a thing for Russians, but I would say this is nothing inherent. This is nothing biological. This is nothing genetic. This is still born of the economic interests of Western European colonialism, because France, Sweden, all of these countries that have waged a long list of wars against Russia, they were in the interest of dominating Russia. Western European colonial powers have always coveted the large territory and the resources of Russia. And they have always, there's a degree of inter-imperialist rivalry when the Tsarist empire was also going after colonial property, going after colonies. So there's an element of that as well. So I would say like the historical anti-Slavic racism is also born of colonialism.
So
Andrew, good.
Yeah, just a couple of things. Respond to your point about getting to know people and changing people's views. I agree. You get to know people, but eventually you need a movement. You need to get people to go less. Now, Ian's point, there are no two differences between the left and the right, is they're serving the same master just differently. So when you look at a peacetime economy where you bring in a lot of immigrants, you're doing it to depress the domestic working class. You're doing it to create an excuse to push austerity. When you get on a war footing, I agree. You adopt a completely different strategy, but it's all in service of the same empire. And I think that the other point here is the ethnocentrism and the racism follows the economic pain and the decline in people's lives. They revert to it primordially, and I think that that's what's hardwired. It's not that there's a hatred of whatever group of individuals. It just gets exacerbated when there's pain, even internally. So my in-laws are Ukrainian. They never had a problem with Russian-speaking people until very, very recently. And if you're in Crimea, you obviously can appreciate that. It's a product of the system, and you got to view it in that abstraction and then boil it down. And I think where the liberals fail when you look at issues of identity, like ethnic groups, racial groups, or whatever, is, yeah, there are those conflicts, there are those bigotries, but they're the result of a system and they're a component in the system. And until you start looking at it in a system-wide way and getting people being objective by it, it's just literally one story after another of, this group's threatening me, let's go start a war with them. It never fixes anything. And I think that really is the challenge here. And unfortunately, I think the final point, and I agree wholeheartedly, is the real issue here with Trump is he took the Band-Aid off the empire. The proceduralism, the decorum, the professionalism, you see that in American politics too. You see it with somebody like Anthony Blinken. He's a straight-faced apologist for the war in Ukraine, for what happened in Gaza as well, and everything else we do. He has decorum, but it's still the same act. With what Trump has done is he's taken the mask off and showed what it really is about, which is just brutishness. And that's what I think gets the Europeans excited. They can't have the charade of professionalism anymore. It's simply an empire doing what empires do. And you can't wiggle your way around that fact.
So I want to clarify what I said. When I said, there's this ethnic hatred, I don't mean like people are pushed out of the womb genetically hating someone without anyone telling him that. No, I mean, ethnicity is culture, right? Even people who are genetically identical, like for example, Poles and Russians are actually genetically more similar to each other than Germans in North and South Germany. Literally, they're genetically more closely related, Poles and Russians. But there are some pretty significant differences, and it's because of hundreds of years of culture. So when we talk about the ethnogenesis of a certain group of people, that's kind of what we mean. It's not just like, oh, is this particular, these particular genetics sprang into existence. It's this particular mix of linguistics and cultural traditions and all this stuff that makes a people distinct from other people. So, and I've said this before on this show, by the way, and I've always gotten pushback from it, but people that are more similar to each other will often express much greater hatreds than people that are very different. Because yes, when you, I know there's racism and there are war crimes, atrocities, colonial war crimes, when you have things like the Crusades or you have wars overseas with a group of people that are entirely different from you, there's a lot of bad things. But when you really, civil wars are considered the worst, and actually over time tends to kill more people than even conventional wars, between different nations across continents. And the reason why is because they just really hate each other. You're going, and it makes sense if you think about it. You ask just pick any random person in the world. Any village on any continent. It's like, who do you hate the most? Who just really grinds your gears, gets under your skin? He might say something like, oh, George Bush gets under my skin, or America gets under my skin, China gets under my skin. He might say something like that. But more likely, he's going to say, well, you know what, that asshole down the street from me, I hate that guy. I hate that guy. That's the most likely, the village down the river from me, that my neighbor, somebody close to him, is far more, exactly, like Zetanaya says, familiarity breeds contempt.
The narcissism of small differences. The narcissism of small differences certainly exists, but I'm not sure how significant that is in a factor in animating world affairs.
So, when it comes to, it is a fairly different viewpoint than what I had 5 years ago. Like if you look at what I wrote 5 years ago before Ukraine, before this stuff happened. It was quite a bit different. And I was generally incredulous at the idea that Europe would get sucked into this war that's so obviously detrimental to them. But I also hadn't interacted with a lot of people from Europe either. And now I have them when they come onto my blog, they come onto my social media places. So I've had, over the past 5 years, I've had pretty extensive conversations with people from various countries. Like I've talked to people from the Baltics, from the Scandinavia, from Central Europe and Western Europe and Britain. And I've generally come to the idea that, yeah, they really hate Slavs. I mean, it's not even whether or not those Slavs are communists, it almost doesn't matter. But I also think they kind of hate each other too. I mean, there's this huge pan-European movement that we're just a big happy family. We're a garden. I don't think it's actually true. What keeps them off each other's throats is this external enemy. So they have this idea that Russia is not in Europe. It's this Asian Mongol country that's an enemy of everything European. And they can focus on that. And that keeps people off. That if there wasn't a Russia to fight over, they would fight each other. I am absolutely sure of it. It's still very tribalistic, because let's face it, humans are tribalistic, no matter where you are. Europe is not different. They just did a very good job of convincing us that they're different, that they're special. And that's really the whole European brand, that every century they have a different brand that makes Europe better than everywhere else. Back in the Middle Ages, it was because they're Christian, and they're the correct kind of Christian also. No, not just Christian, they're the correct kind of Christian. They're Catholic. Then they had the Enlightenment, which led to the Crimean War and all this. It's like, being Christian is dumb. It's silly. There's no God. It's just pure, we're pure, rational, logical people. And then it turned into, in the 20th century, you had communism, and then mainly the reaction to communism, which was fascism. And then you had, after World War II, you had liberal democracy, which they treat like a religion. They don't even treat democracy as a political system, and they treat it as an ideology. And I'm not even sure what exactly comes after neoliberalism, but it'll be something similar. And that's the main difference between Americans, I think, and Europe. Americans think in terms of physical, quantifiable superiority. It doesn't mean it's true, but something that's quantifiable. So you can say America is better because we have better tanks, we have more advanced technology, we have more money, we have 12 aircraft carriers. These are things that can be quantified, and this is why America is better and stronger and superior to everyone else. So you ask a European, they won't give an answer like that. They won't say, oh, the Netherlands has, a light carrier or, 6 destroyer. They won't give answers like that, or even their nukes. They won't, for the European countries that have nukes, which is, I guess, 3. But they'll give something like, we're culturally superior. We are a democracy. We have liberal values. We're not we're anti-racist. Am I making sense, guys? They'll give cultural.
I mean, that's kind of what that one guy said. We got to protect our garden, from these barbarians. That was the mentality he was articulating. But Andrew, what is your response? I mean, there's a lot of truth with what Ian says. But is it missing another more important driver? I mean,
I think a couple of points. One, about the civil wars and conflicts. If you're a smart ruling oligarch, whatever color you are, and you want conflict and you want to keep people in disarray, you have them fight one another, and you find literally every excuse, whether it's ethnic, ideological, or whatever, to stir up enough irrationality to keep people at each other's throats rather than focus on the boot that's on the back of their neck. And that's a pretty consistent strategy. I think with the Europe that you're describing, it's more of, like I said, Anthony Blinken style superiority. It's a little bit more guarded. It's a little bit more mature. I generally agree with you about how they view themselves. I'll disagree with you on the point about the U.S. Yeah, we're boastful, obviously. We talk about what we have. But if you spend much time outside of the polite liberal centers in the U.S. and even within the polite liberal centers, we have a similar, God is on our side ideology. I mean, just look at Manifest Destiny. Look at this weird, cult-like view of capitalism and neoliberalism in the U.S. It manifests itself a little bit differently in the U.S., but it's definitely there. And
USA is just Europe 2.0.
Yeah, I think it's rougher though, and like I said about Trump, it's not as refined, it's not as cultured, it hasn't had the time to have the social institutions that entrench it and make it look historical, but it's essentially the same mentality, just in a different way. I mean, for example, I went to some charity dinner a couple of months ago that I got roped into going. It was, just something about recreation or something. And at this dinner, they had an opening prayer, and the guy giving the prayer is like, well, you got to admit, God is on America's side. This is the best country on the earth. And not talking about our resources, we obviously won out on that. I don't think we'd be as hegemonic as we were or are if we didn't win out on that. But the ideology is there. And I think it's, in terms of developing clear, universal theoretical models, there's always going to be the moral superiority or the God is with us ideology that entrenches, especially a dominant actor, but any dominant actor. And it coalesces differently depending upon where that actor's at. So a civil war, you're going to see that schism. But with what you're describing with Europe, you look at the history. Small countries have been at war with one another for a long time. There are even, like, you go to the UK, you call a Scotsman an Englishman, there's going to be attention there. But when you
they hate each other. They still hate each other.
But when you have the overarching threat of Russia or China or whoever else, all of a sudden we're part of the same community, even though those underlying differences that are learned, that are enculturated in everybody from a very young age to the point where they're almost inherent, are still beneath the surface, and they'll pop up, given some different type of circumstances. And I think with what's happened with Ukraine, you're seeing that realignment. And the real question in my mind is, and I think it's the same thing with the US, is can you really pull it off at this point? Because the targets of this type of imperialism, whether it's Russia or China or the developing world, and you definitely see this with Iran, have learned, all right, we don't want to be the colony anymore. We want to develop economically independently. We don't want to play this game. And there comes a point where, again, that empire pushes a little too hard against another state and the state wins. And I mean, you just see this recently with what's happened with the US and Iran. I mean, Iran is not invading the US, but they're not responding in the way that a similar country might have responded before. You saw this with Iraq. They're not collapsing. They're saying, look, leave us alone. And I think geopolitically, that's the real question is, can that balance of power be realigned? And then from the perspective of theory, because that's really what we're all thinking about here is, can we conceive of a system where you have state actors that are not expansionistic, that intentionally create internal and external protocols to live at peace with one another and look out for everyone's welfare rather than engage in endless conflict? And I think that's the real ultimate proposition here.
So, I mean, I want to, you mentioned your pastor said, God is on our side. I mean, I can't read his mind, but from evangelicals I've talked to in the past, if you ask them to articulate, well, why is God on America's side? How do you know that? Usually they will give quantifiable, which again makes them different, because they will say, well, because the USA is richer. The USA has more stuff. There's other bad countries like Russia and China and Cuba that don't have enough food, don't have pineapples in the winter. But, Americans have tropical food all year round. We import, Jell-O, and you know what I'm saying? They have this. It's a very unfortunately, it is kind of like you said, rough. It's kind of a primitive. It's literally like an Old Testament, like even before the like Hebrews before the Babylonian captivity didn't even have the concept of an afterlife. So if you have books like the Book of Job, where you literally just receive your riches while you're alive. So if you're a virtuous person, you're rich, and if you're a bad person, you're poor. That's literally what was. So it's good. So if you look at the USA in those terms, it's a really kind of backwards, but it is nonetheless, it's something that's quantifiable and is different from Europeans. Like you ask a European, a Dutchman or a German, or I don't know, a Swede maybe. Like you ask these guys, why is Europe better? I mean, they won't mention God like an American will. They won't even mention that. But
I think
let me finish real quick. But if you ask him, he'll say, well, it's because we have a better culture, we have democracy, 40% of our military is gay, we have, they'll give stuff like that. You're like, what does how many gay soldiers you have to do with anything, or why that makes you better? But those are the answers they'll give, literally. But I'm sorry, Leo, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say, like, we're a little bit in danger of getting lost in the weeds a little bit. But I just want to say that the domestic class war in the West has been lost. Let's face reality. After 40 years of neoliberalism, after the violent suppression of the Black Panthers and the Latin Kings and these Marxist revolutionary groups in the 60s and 70s, counterintelligence program, and like massive, constant, incessant anti-communist propaganda. Basically, the class ideological war, the mind war, the class war in the West, in the USA, in Germany, in France, in England, to various degrees, has largely, I would say, been lost. We need to face this failure. We need to analyze the particular reasons for these repeated failures, these utter failure of the Western left to even curb the rate of police murders, right? BLM, we've had like so much awareness, so much protest, so much popular awareness, consciousness, changed nothing, right? The rate of police brutality keeps rising. So the international sphere, the geopolitical conflicts unfolding in the world today, in Ukraine, in Iran, in Palestine, and maybe about to pop off, or surrounding China, all of the trade war, blah, 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 against China, and all of these things, anti-imperialism is also class war. That is class war expressed on an international scale, on an international level. So I think what will get us truly past this knot of this impasse, this knot that is not able to be disentangled, to untangle, that we cannot untangle, is what Ian's part of what Ian's essay was addressing, that the failure in Ukraine will bring these contradictions to the fore, and it will totally dismantle the legitimacy of the establishment. And we may have a period of fascism or quasi-fascism, in the imperial court, in the USA, in Germany, in England, etc. But I think the real victory for the working class will be won on the international level. I mean, I think China, the People's Republic of China, we should pay attention to always to use PRC as often as possible, because the imperialists will never say PRC. They always say China. But anyway, the PRC and the RF, the Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China are managing this transitional, very dangerous period quite well, I would say. I would say these are the adults in the room that, through strategic patience, through the long-term thinking, not escalating, even if they are perceived as being weak by people who only know the language of bombs and murder, are managing the decline of the West. And I think there's going to be pain. There's absolutely going to be pain in the immediate future. But I think the long game, I think we have already won. The global working class, the global proletariat has already won. I don't know if that's difficult to sort of like.
I know Andrew had a thought like 5 minutes ago. I saw it.
Well, just a couple of things. I think getting back to the materialism, that Ian's talking about, you have to view it kind of in a hierarchy, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So when you were talking about the book of Job, the first thing that popped in my mind, I don't know if you're familiar with this, the prosperity gospel. Have you heard of this? Basically, amongst evangelicals, they have this idea that, God wants you to be rich. And it's very materialistic. I think some of it gets into our Calvinist history and so on. But I think on another level, it shows our social and economic development if we're focusing on material things. When you talk about, for example, like gays in European militaries, what pops in my mind in America is you see similar thinking with the liberal urbanite crowd, basically the types that listen to NPR and watch CNN, where their idea of what America should be like or what is an indicator of our superiority is the same thing. I think that they just exist on a continuum of abstraction from the material up through this abstract. But again, it just creates the connotation that we're the chosen ones. We have superiority, whether or not, in fact, we do. And to Ian's comment, to the other comment about the proletariat and the working class already winning, I think we should be cautious. But what I think is going on, and this gets into just kind of a far earlier observation, is people aren't believing the narrative or the propaganda, which is really the first step. So you mentioned BLM. Thinking minds do not support racism. They do not support authoritarianism or police brutality. But also people intuitively know that a narrative about BLM or DEI in the corporate world is not going to fix the underlying inequities, and that you have to have far more structural readjustments, and that a lot of the people's cynicism about these pseudo reforms is they just know that it's more nonsense and propaganda that won't work. And the key to overcoming it is creating an alternative and a narrative where people see the alternative as being viable and there are realistic solutions. So just an example of what you have to do to create solidarity. You talk to a lot of right wingers, they don't like the DEI stuff. They view it as being politically correct. They're dismissive of it, and to a great extent, rightfully so. And I don't believe that they're dismissive of it because they're inherently racist, or that if really given a structured opportunity, they'd really have bias against the groups that they go after. They're doing it because, one, they know that the narrative is fake, but they also, in their own lives, so if you look at life expectancy statistics in the US, middle-aged white men, so basically people in my age demographic with less than a college degree, have seen the largest drop in life expectancy and economic position of any group. And nobody's talking about it. Nobody's saying, look, there's a class problem here. The middle class has been eviscerated, the working class has been eviscerated, but you're focusing on this ethnic group without bringing me to the table. And I think in terms of the dialogue, that really is what needs to be addressed. And again, offering alternative models. And I think with the PRC, the final point, it's hard for the Western mind, and you definitely see it in America, to wrap its mind around the concept that you can have development, you can have economic progress and an increase in a standard of living without an empire, without a hierarchy, and that you can be scientific about it and you can genuinely improve people's lives without all the trappings of empire. So you talk to people about dominant actors, there's this basically repetitive narrative of you get the empire, it grows and it develops and it eventually becomes corrupt and it collapses, and then there's a dark ages afterwards. People can't understand if you have a rational population and you use modern understanding, modern knowledge, you can have stability indefinitely. And I think that really is the challenge of dialogue with people and getting people to think outside of the box, because they just go around over and over again of, various levels of discontent and irrationality about a system that's really built to exploit them.
Yeah, very good points. Ironically, I think what you just said largely affirms my assertion that in the long term victory of the proletariat is already well underway, even domestically, because the material basis for the sense of superiority of American exceptionalism is already eroding, like rapidly eroding. And you see the younger generation, even in Germany. I talk to younger people in their 20s, and overwhelmingly they have a favorable view of the PRC. And so the ideological war, I think, is already in the beginning stages of failing for the empire. And yeah, this is what I'm trying to say is the vision, the strategy, the long-term strategy of the PRC, of the CPC, of the Communist Party of China, and other actors around the world really is working. It is the only way towards bringing about a new era of mutual prosperity and peace. And let me just say one more thing. The original social democracy means reaching socialism, defeating the bourgeois oligarchy through elections. I would say that given a totally new global structure, a new global situation in which the power balance is reaching parity between the colonized world, or beginning to approach parity, I think in this global situation, new possibilities emerge. I think what the CPC wants is not a violent revolution in the USA or in Germany or in France or in England. I think this long-term strategy of reshaping global trade, of creating interdependencies, of creating a global structure of stability, economic stability. I think this is the path towards opening up new possibilities of historical progress in the USA, in Germany, in England. I think this process is well underway.
So, I mean, I don't want to vulgarize your great comments, Leo, but I mean, I think I agree with you. And I think essentially you're just saying that, the global class struggle is being won, but it's not being won in the imperial core. It's being won in the periphery. And these great civilizations like China, Russia, and Iran are really winning the class struggle in the 21st century, which manifests itself in the struggle against Western imperialism. And so I think,
and that will lead also to victory for the working class in the West as well.
That's ultimately because the material conditions in this country is what needs to change for people to be able to think differently. And it's the material basis that allows people the luxury of disconnecting their minds from reality. They don't have to know what's going on, because they're fine if they don't know what's going on. And so this gives them the luxury of just being completely disconnected. But as the material conditions shift, and as the empire declines more and more, they're going to no longer have that luxury, and that'll open up opportunities for us to reach them. But what I would like to talk about is predictions for the future. We have current events going on right now. What do we think is going to result from the West's inability to get Iran under control, to maintain their control of the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency? Do we see the U.S. retreating and passively accepting a new normal, or do we see them doubling down and really overthrowing the game board in order to, burn everything down to rule over the ashes, essentially. So these are interesting questions that I'm curious what you guys think. But if there's other more important and pressing things that Andrew wanted to say before I'm changing the subject, you're more than welcome to. But just, whatever sticks out to you the most, Andrew.
I think that the only thing I would have to add to the prior discussion that's kind of a segue into the topic you just raised is really the role of theory and empirical understanding and analysis in trying to structure solutions and understanding for problems. Because really, the challenge here is not the problems, it's the decider's ability as to how to respond to the problems. So when you look at what's going on with Iran, really, I think there are three propositions here, and I'm sure you would all agree with them. Either the oligarchs are isolated and comfortable to the point where they see nothing wrong with starting World War III. There are discussions of this. You look at people mentioning glibly in the US news media about using nuclear weapons. That's option one. Option two is they manage the decline and they just immiserate the lives of people in the West and the US, which, Billy, you're about my age, so you can kind of probably recall the better times and how our standard of living has been progressively been going down, especially over the past 20 or so years. And they're ruling over the ashes of a hollowed out empire where internationally the West is too weak to deal with China or with whatever other developing competitor. Or ideally, there is a reformist movement that resolves internal problems and creates a new equilibrium. And I think that's the challenge. I think right now it's hard to predict. And a lot of it, I think, is dependent upon chance, especially when you're dealing with a powerful actor like the US. You make one bad decision, you have your finger on that button, it's going to change the trajectory of the world permanently. But at the same time, the underlying social currents, so the aggregate of people's attitudes about the empire, even internally, are in fact changing. And if there's enough opportunity to cultivate dialogues about how to address things, you can see improvement. I don't know exactly how that improvement will occur, but again, if you have that thoughtful, objective, and scientific understanding of these trends and you try to come up with good, beneficial solutions, you can resolve it. And that really is the issue. And it's anybody's guess what will happen. And I think from my mind as somebody who works in education, I can see it going either way. I can see people buying into, because even now in like higher ed, there's still persistent rhetoric about the greatness of neoliberalism and the world being flat and whatnot, things that I think a lot of people long since recognize is not working. And that delusion can go on for a long time, but then on the other hand, a lot of people are saying, look, this isn't working, I'm not buying it anymore. We've got to be pragmatic and realistic and come up with alternatives. And that really is the proposition.
Let me just say one thing. Your first scenario of and Billy's scenario of ruling over the ashes, of waging total war, nuclear war. I think, if we look at empirical reality, if we look at economics, if we look at supply chains, if we look at manufacturing, the capacity of empire to even wage this apocalyptic war, I think, is almost non-existent by now. Even waging total war against China and Russia and Iran or whatever, I think the capacity, the literal, like, physical material capacity to wage that war, even nuclear war, I think nearly non-existent. It's not possible when the PRC manufactures all of the components for F-16s, manufactures all of the components for drones, for robotics, for even all of the minerals that are critical to military technology is monopolized, not in the capitalist sense, but is dominated by far by the People's Republic of China. I think the even like we need to factor that in as well. So probably a positive point. And as for your second scenario, I see absolutely this happening. I mean, whatever you want to say about Mamdani, like whatever you want to say, there are new. I mean, this sound like a social democrat. Like, watch the hardcore leftists give me a ton of shit for this. But I do see people waking up and people choosing new options. I mean, people like Mamdani has said some pretty anti-establishment things. I'm not saying he's the answer. I'm not saying Hassan Piker is the answer. I'm not saying the ACP, the American Communist Party, is the answer. But I am saying that there is a kind of new awakening due to all of these global things unfolding, processes unfolding.
Well, it's been a great discussion. We're an hour and a half in. I know we are probably ready to get close to wrapping things up. It's been a privilege to participate in this discussion. I appreciate everybody's contributions. What else do we want to say before we wrap it up?
I will close. This is my closing thought. I think this hyper capitalist regime, if you will, or order, or that came into existence. It started at the end of World War II and really accelerated under Reagan and Thatcher, this neoliberal hyper-capitalist system is going to come to an end. And the USA, Americans are going to have this reckoning of how do you orient yourself in the world when you're not the richest. And that was your entire value system that you were taught. That the God's chosen people are the richest in the world. If you're not the richest, then you're not chosen by God. That's going to be a serious reawakening. And I think with so I would say that yes, the end state that we get might, Leo might be right. The end state we get might be better, but well, there's a lot of bad things that could happen. We could just have a nuclear war, and we could have a nuclear war. In the next war would be fraught with rocks and sticks. That could happen. So there's a lot of ways it could not turn out good. But overall, maybe we'll just have to see where this goes.
Bad things will certainly happen in the short term, in the next 10 years. The next 5-10 years in Europe, in the USA, for sure things will get worse. But yeah, I'm not going to repeat myself about the long-term victory of the working class. Billy, you're muted.
Bill, you're muted again.
Andrew, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so one final point of Leo's comment about the first option in war. You're 100% correct, because if we were dumb enough to start a full-out conflict with the PRC or any major state actor, it would eviscerate us very quickly. Our infrastructure is so weak at this point, and people are not very well adjusted to hardship in the U.S. that it would be. I think it would cause an internal collapse in the U.S. because the last time you've seen anything like that might have been in the Great Depression 80, 90 years ago. I think more broadly, though, the real proposition here, and this is kind of an invitation, is how do we promote people doing intellectual work and engaging in dialogue and rational analysis to help build and develop understanding to come up with practical solutions that broadly appeal to people. And TikTok, but also the content of TikTok. And the ideas that, for example, living where I do, that can appeal to my conservative neighbors enough so that, you know, they get out of their box a little bit and realize, yeah, I can get on board with this. And maybe we don't need to go down this obviously self-destructive path. And I think that, you know, requires a mindset of being intellectually open, but also, again, engaging stuff. And it's good to see you guys thinking about this stuff. And I think that the key is just inviting more and more people to think about it and organizing discussions, because the final point I'll leave you with is what really defeats these ideas in a place like higher education and academic research isn't that they're wrong. It's that they're never explored in the first place. So you mention a certain idea, as I said before, you get a visceral reaction that that's nonsense, that's not a testable hypothesis, we can't look into that or develop that, resources never get allocated to understanding or studying it, and you can't see an alternative. Now, we now have the alternative of the PRC, which has a very well-developed university system, a well-developed understanding of things like public management that offers an alternative. But internally in a society like the US, you have to develop that internal understanding. You have to allocate resources to doing it. You have to get people thinking in that way before any progress can be made. So.
And by goods.
So no, great discussion. My closing thought, I'm not even sure where to go. I think the trajectory is clear. I think that, you know, the West is embarking on a strategy that's going to result in a crisis. And so they're going to be a crisis mode, and that's going to be the new normal. And they're going to try and manage that crisis in order to harm China, Russia, and Iran to the greatest extent they can. And we're going to be harmed as well. The elites, of course, are going to be largely shielded from all this harm that they're going to cause. But I don't think they want nuclear war. You know, I don't think they want a hot war with China. But I think they're going to probably want a proxy war with China. They're probably going to want Japan, South Korea, the Philippines to play the Europe that Europe is currently playing in the Ukraine thing. And they want to sit back, protected by their two oceans, and manage a downward spiral, a race to the bottom globally, in order to make sure that China doesn't surpass them, to make sure that multipolarity never takes place. And I think there's a lot of danger involved with that strategy, but I think that is the clear strategy that they're embarked upon. And again, when is it going to play out? How soon before they declare crisis mode? Because it's going to be a declaration. It's going to be rolled out just like COVID was rolled out. You know, hey, we're in a crisis. And then that's where, you know, they have a lot of plans that they're going to unfurl. So that's my prediction for the future. I don't know if that's going to happen under the Trump administration. I expect it will, because I think they want to blame Trump for all these bad things that people aren't going to be happy about. You know, they want to put it all on Trump and not on the class that's really pushing it, driving it. But anyway, it could come after Trump. You know, it could be the Democrats that replace him that really, manage this issue. But that's my 2 cents. Guys, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to have this discussion. We've gone quite long, and we will reconvene maybe on Thursday. Andrew, we're going to have you back very soon. Leo, as always, thank you. Ian, I will see you probably Thursday, or if not next week. So
goods for the people.
All right, guys, everyone, thank you for watching. Thank you for watching us.
Goods for the people.com.